This conference is about long COVID kids and sickness prevention and schools. What's the connection? Well, let me walk you through it. This conference was born out of countless direct messages between moms over the last year where we expressed frustration that our families were sick yet again, and the infections always seemed to stem from schools and daycares. Some of our kids missed weeks, sometimes months of school because they were sick. Some of our kids ended up in the hospital with respiratory infections. We observed times when half our kids' class was absent due to infection. We walked into our school front offices to find it nearly empty because the staff was out sick, and some of our kids even ended up in school gyms for days because there wasn't enough staff due to illness. As we often say at long COVID families, illness is a disruptor. It's as though sickness has walked into our houses, flipped all the tables, and then leaves, only to show up uninvited again and again. And frankly, we are exhausted. So when organizing committee met to determine this year's topic, it was unanimous: sickness prevention. We went off the hamster wheel. We want to stop the chaos that it brings. We want our long COVID kids to have the space and time to heal. And let's talk about long COVID kids, because we have noticed, and maybe you have too, that our experience of sickness has changed since a COVID infection. In particular, our long COVID kids seem to get sick more often, stay sick longer, and sometimes develop even more symptoms after infection. Sickness is preventing our kids from being in school. Sickness is preventing our kids from learning. And we want to prevent that. We want our kids in school. We want our kids to learn. And we want our kids out of their beds and experiencing childhood to its fullest. We want sickness prevention. You might be thinking, wait, I've heard kids need to get sick in order to develop immunity, to protect them from future infection. You may be thinking, I heard that the reason kids were so sick is because of immunity debt. Well, yeah, we heard that too. So we looked into it, and what we learned is the concept of immunity debt seems to have originated from a position paper published in August 2021 in Infectious Diseases Now. A position paper is when an author or authors put forth an argument or a position on a topic that enables discussion on emerging topics. Sorry, I got a little distracted because somebody is trying to invite my child to play a video game. Let me refocus. Yeah, so we're a family group. So when we looked into it, what we learned is the concept of immunity seems to have originated from a position paper published in August 2021. So a position paper really enables discussion on emerging topics without the experimentation and original research normally presented. It's intended for discussion purposes in academic circles. It's not intended to guide public health policy. Part of the confusion around the topic of sickness and immunity is what is called the hygiene hypothesis, which states that early childhood exposure to certain bacteria that we co-evolved with as a species helps educate the developing immune system in babies and kids. The hygiene hypothesis was updated in 2003 to note that viral infections in particular do not support immune development. And in fact, they're often damaging. We should note that it can take an average of 15 to 20 years for new medical information to break into public consciousness. So if this information is new to you, that makes sense, and that's right on schedule. And this part is important. There are now numerous studies that show COVID-19, even a mild infection, can impair our immune system, cause organ damage, reduce our resistance to other infections. Now, I do want to recognize that these studies are primarily adult studies. But as an organization supporting kids with long COVID since 2021, we see something different about our long COVID kids' immune systems. And we're just waiting for the research to catch up. We are an organization of caregivers, and we have sat with this information, talked to experts, and watched what is happening to our kids in our schools, in our communities, and all evidence points to preventing sickness should be a priority. So here we are hosting a conference about long COVID kids and sickness prevention as an access to education issue. So we have put links. We will be putting links in the chat to all the information I just provided. I'm going to pause for a second because it looks like someone may have a question. Okay. Thank you. I'll come back to that in a little bit. So before I begin, I would like to share a quick story that I believe will ground the information that I'm about to share with you today. So about a year ago, I tweeted out information about long COVID, as I often do, and a very nice woman responded that she appreciated the information, and she asked what the source material was, which made me smile because I do appreciate someone who verifies their sources. I replied that the information came directly from the patient community. We are the source material. When we talk about the effects of long COVID and associated conditions, we are talking about our bodies, our lived experience. It's important to remind all of us that for millions and millions of people with long COVID is not an abstract concept. The patient community literally embodies it. Today, I will share with you the expertise of the patient community as the authorities on our own bodies and our own lived experience, as we are the source material. The reason I founded Long COVID Families was to create the supportive community that I had needed when I was a child who was disabled by a virus. When I was young, I was diagnosed with mono twice and developed infection-triggered conditions that mirror long COVID in many ways. I was first diagnosed with mono when I was 11, and I developed symptoms that I struggled to explain or even understand. I would tell adults that I couldn't think, and they told me to focus more and try harder. I told adults I felt tired, so very tired, and they told me to get a better night's sleep. I had a sensation in my chest that I struggled to articulate. I told adults that I felt like I couldn't breathe, but my tests were normal, and the doctor told me I had anxiety. There was no evidence anything was wrong, so I stopped telling adults about my symptoms. I was diagnosed again with mono at the age of 14, and my symptoms intensified. By 19, I was losing consciousness regularly and given the clinical diagnosis of a partial complex seizure disorder. The diagnosis didn't feel right to me, but I was told I wasn't the expert. The neurologist was, so I silenced the urge to question. While the diagnosis of seizures explained some of my neurological symptoms, I was told that depression was the reason for my crushing fatigue. Desperate to feel better, I took all the prescription pills they offered and went to therapy for years. But my physical symptoms never improved. In fact, they got worse as I got older. I was a public school teacher in my 20s, but I had to leave the profession due to my health, as the job was too physically intensive and mentally exhausting for my body. After I left the classroom, my health improved, and I got married, and I had a beautiful baby girl. But the stress of pregnancy, caring for a baby, and trying to work crashed me by the time she was 2. For the next 3 years, I spent 80% of my time in bed, unable to stand up most days. It took 3 years of appointments until I finally got in front of the right doctor who knew to ask the right questions and referred me to the right hospital that ran the right tests. I got lucky. And suddenly I went from 30 years of your tests are normal to your tests indicate that you have postural orthostatic tachycardia syndrome, or POTS, mast cell activation syndrome, or MCAS, and hypermobility. I had never heard of any of these conditions. I was at a well-respected hospital, and after going through my detailed medical history, the doctor told me that the mono infections from my childhood almost certainly triggered these conditions. At 39, I learned that the sensation in my chest that I struggled to describe when I was 11 years old and continue to experience to this very day was tachycardia, a rapid heartbeat that I experienced in response to blood pooling in my legs. And it turned out I didn't have a seizure disorder after all. That was a misdiagnosis. So almost 30 years after I first told adults that I can't breathe, I can't think, I'm tired all the time, I was finally validated. I want to pause here for a moment before we move on to emphasize a point. There's a stereotype that patients exaggerate or fake illness for attention. But if you ask actual patients, we will tell you that our culture is very uncomfortable with illness and isn't quite sure what to make of people who don't get better. As chronically ill patients, we almost never get the kind of attention that's flattering, and we learn real quick to only share our symptoms with people we feel safe with. I want to emphasize when I was 11 years old and I told adults that I can't breathe, and it was dismissed as anxiety, I stopped telling adults my symptoms. When I was 19 years old and I was diagnosed with seizures, I questioned the diagnosis, but I was told I wasn't the expert. So I stopped telling doctors about my neurological symptoms. When I was in my 20s and struggling to maintain employment due to crushing fatigue, and I was told it was a mental illness, and then when therapy and medication didn't help, I simply stopped pursuing medical care. If you ask for help and you don't get it, you stop asking. If it feels unsafe to tell people about your symptoms, you stop telling people about your symptoms. That's especially true for children. I am one of the few with infection-triggered illness who have the privilege of diagnosis and the privilege of quality medical care. Again, for reference, my diagnoses are POTS, MCAS, and hypermobility. These are common diagnoses among people with long COVID, including children. Additionally, I, like more than 50% of people with long COVID, meet the criteria for ME. Information about all of these conditions can be found at our website, longcovidfamilies.org. With my new diagnoses came new prescriptions and lifestyle strategies to manage my symptoms, and I could finally get out of bed most days. 2 years later, COVID descended upon us, and when I heard pundits on TV say that COVID did not affect children, I felt a chill run down my spine as I thought to myself, how would they even know? Because if anyone understood how an infection-triggered condition could be missed in a child, it was me. So in April 2020, I posted about my conditions on social media for the first time, telling my story as a warning to my friends, and I kept posting. By fall, I started getting messages like my sister's son had COVID. It's months later. He's not better and he has symptoms like yours. And then I got more messages and more messages. And that's what ultimately led to long COVID families. We are a patient-led grassroots organization that understands that illness is a disruptor. After illness, many of us, including children, are left feeling lost. Who am I now? What is this body? And how do I engage in the world? What is underappreciated about long COVID is that it's too much, too fast, and a direct threat to survival needs, as it can compromise a person's ability to work and go to school. The sensations of heightened response from our bodies when in a flare set off alarm bells throughout, signaling that the threat is coming from within. Too much, too fast, and a threat to survival is the very definition of trauma. Our families are in active trauma with little to no support outside the patient community. The burden is heavy and we are struggling. When I asked my community about what they thought I should share with this audience today, trauma was a common theme. As one mother said, let them know you are dealing with a family in crisis. Caring for a child with a poorly understood, complex illness like long COVID is all-consuming. And then you have to navigate the medical system. And then you have to work to ensure your child receives an education despite all of the challenges. And then there are often multiple people with long COVID within one family. It is a full-time job, and parents, mostly mothers, are dropping out of the workforce in large numbers to provide care for their children. Long COVID not only disables our bodies, but it disrupts careers and derails entire families as bills mount, tensions rise, and the security of food and shelter is threatened. Unfortunately, for many in our community, schools can be an additional source of stress and conflict. There are 3 primary pressure points between long COVID families and school districts. Pressure point 1 is lack of understanding of energy limits and symptom stressors. Pressure point 2 is attendance policies. Pressure point 3 is the lack of understanding of behavior related to long COVID. So what I would like to share with you now is a patient and family perspective on energy limits, symptom stressors, attendance, and how long COVID can manifest as behavior. A core symptom of long COVID is persistent physical fatigue that is not relieved by rest. Some patients relate it to the fatigue you experience when you have a bad flu, but worse. Can you remember being really, really sick? Can you feel the exhaustion in your bones? Can you feel how hard it is to lift your head off the pillow? How it feels like you're walking through sand when you finally get out of bed? Imagine that bone tiredness radiating through your entire body. Now, imagine putting on a backpack, getting on a bus, and hearing the joyous laughter of children only to cover your ears because to you, it sounds like pounding in your skull. Now imagine having to sit at a desk under fluorescent lights, trying to hold your head up, trying to learn. Now imagine you go home and try to rest, but it brings you no relief. Imagine going to sleep only to wake up as tired as you were when you first went to bed the night before. Imagine getting back on that bus, sitting under those buzzing lights yet again, and trying to learn. Now imagine one morning you try to get out of bed, but you collapse because you're dizzy and weak. So you crawl back into bed, hide under the covers, trying to silence the pain. Now imagine you're 8. That's just a glimpse of what our community means when we say fatigue. Now imagine you're that child's mother receiving a phone call from a school demanding to know why your child is not in class and being told if this continues, CPS will be called. That is what our community is dealing with. It's not easy to get a doctor's note for long COVID if you don't have access to medical care, or your pediatrician isn't informed, or your child never tested positive for COVID, as most long COVID kids never tested positive. Did you know that research shows PCR tests missed up to 90% of COVID cases in children? The source of that information can be found in the Nature article entitled Long COVID, Major Findings, Mechanisms, and Recommendations, published January 13th, 2023. In addition to fatigue, another core symptom for long COVID that schools do not understand is post-exertional malaise, or PEM. Honestly, it's even hard for the patient to understand PEM, as there is a delayed reaction between a trigger and a symptom. PEM is the flare of symptoms and or appearance of new symptoms after exertion, often presenting 24 hours after a triggering event. Physical activity, cognitive overexertion, and sensory overload can all trigger PEM. Post-exertional malaise is a unique symptom. It is different from the experience of fatigue after overexertion in healthy children. Please hear that. It's different. It is not the same thing as being more tired than normal after an activity. Exertion is defined here as anything that stresses or strains the system. Some stressors can be controlled for, and some cannot. Identifying triggers for post-exertional malaise is vital to a child's physical and psychological well-being. Post-exertional malaise can look like a child running around at recess, only to slump in his chair and struggle to keep his head up after lunch. PEM can look like a teenager excitedly talking to her friends and actively participating in class on a Tuesday, and then zoning out in class on a Wednesday, unable to further process new information after hours of cognitive and physical stress from the day before. It can look like making it through the day of school, only to crawl into bed as soon as the child gets home. As patients, we are often caught in a crash cycle, especially if we are unaware of the strategy of pacing. No one explained PEM to me when I was young, so it took me a really long time to organically connect the trigger to the crash. It only became apparent when I started walking in the morning with a friend for exercise. We would have a lovely walk, and then within a few hours, I would be in bed so exhausted it felt dangerous to move. My body almost frozen. I was outside my energy envelope on those walks. I was using energy my body did not have to give. And in response, my body became virtually immobile to regain the necessary energy reserves. It is like people with long COVID and associated conditions have a smaller internal battery and a faulty charger. We charge slowly and never quite fully. As patients, the way we manage the symptom of PEM is by pacing, which is an activity management strategy. Pacing means being active when able and resting when tired. The goal of pacing is to prevent worsening of symptoms rather than to do more each day. We have a pacing guide specific to children that will be made available to you that provides further guidance on activity management. Pacing is a key strategy to remain connected to the world. Now let's talk about triggers. What triggers someone with long COVID can vary widely, so believe the patient when they tell you it is a trigger. However, there are some common triggers. Barometric pressure changes, for one. I remember when I taught middle school, we could tell a storm was coming because the kids became a little more alive, as we would say. Our bodies naturally respond to the environmental stressors. Our bodies naturally respond to our environment. However, the bodies of those of us with long COVID respond to environmental stressors with an avalanche of symptoms. The more stressors we are exposed to, the louder our symptoms get. The less stressors we are exposed to, the quieter our symptoms get. So while we do not know yet how to fix long COVID, we do know how to quiet down our symptoms. And kids need the help from schools, families, their community to do that. Things like light, sound, noise stress our bodies. The amount of cognitive tasks we're asked to do adds up. Walking upstairs is one of the hardest things for our bodies to do. PE will often crash us. When symptoms get loud, our bodies start to shut down and learning cannot happen. So we need schools, our families, communities to work with us to minimize the stressors that long COVID kids are exposed to so that they can engage in the world and learn at school and participate in the community. Another stressor you may not consider is infection. Infection is a stress on anyone's body. But remember, long COVID kids' batteries deplete faster and are slower to charge. What we are seeing in our long COVID kids is that they're not recovering as quickly as they once did from infections. Infections can literally crash our child for weeks as the body puts all its energy towards fighting off the infection. Again, we have a smaller battery that doesn't charge as quickly, and yet we have schools telling us to send our kids back to class, still symptomatic, sometimes still testing positive for COVID. By forcing kids back into school buildings too soon, we are not allowing our children the ability to rest and recover. And this could have serious consequences on our children's health. If we make children override their body's need for rest, what we observe in the patient community is that the children's long COVID symptoms get worse. Additionally, we are observing the further disabling of long COVID kids upon COVID reinfection. One mother shared, after the first COVID infection, my son could still attend school. But after the second COVID infection, my son's fatigue was too much, and we were forced to homeschool. Our parents are trying to protect their children's health by keeping them home when sick, which often puts them in conflict with those monitoring attendance. A parent shared, "We were hounded by office staff about attendance. Some kids need more than 5 days to recover from an illness." Our children need time to rest and recover. We need schools, our community at large, to work with us to protect our children's health so that they're able to attend school and learn in the future. Now, I'd like to talk about how long COVID can manifest as behavior. And I will begin by reading a quote taken from an email a mother sent her child's school. In the email, she references PANS, which stands for Pediatric Acute Onset Neuropsychiatric Syndrome. I will talk about that more in a moment, but first, the mother's email. It reads, out of character problems like regression, rage, OCD, mental health flares, and phobias can be part of long COVID, especially for kids with PANS. So we do need to look out for them. They aren't simply mental health symptoms, but in our case are due to brain inflammation and part of the physiological and potential treatable conditions. Parents describe PANS as losing their child. Symptoms can include tics, anxiety, mood swings, rigidity, aggression, baby talk, sudden changes with fine motor skills, trouble with memory, sudden difficulty with reading and math, and new bedwetting. It's all triggered by infection. There are treatments that seem to work for some children, but it is extremely hard to get a diagnosis and treatment due to lack of medical expertise on the condition. There are long COVID clinics that do offer help for PANS, but there is a wait list and it usually requires travel for the family. And for children who do not have a positive PCR test, parents may not know their child has long COVID. So that child will never see a long COVID clinic. Additionally, PANS has been known to be triggered by other infections like mono, Lyme, or even the flu. It is more commonly known that strep can trigger a similar neuroinflammation, and in the case of strep, that condition is called PANDAS. The patient community sometimes gets a bad rap as resistant to medical health diagnoses and support, but it's more nuanced than that. In the patient community, we work very hard to destigmatize mental health needs and treatment. And most of us in the community with the privilege of resources have benefited greatly from mental health support because mental health conditions can co-occur with infection-triggered conditions. And we are grateful for the mental health professionals who support us. What concerns us, however, is when a mental health condition gets blurred with an infection-triggered condition, rather than held as two distinct medical conditions, because diagnosis drives treatment. So if a child has an infection-triggered PANS, but it gets labeled a mood disorder, they are not getting effective treatment, and the suffering continues. We have children in our community who went through countless antidepressants before doctors realized inflammation was driving the symptom. Coming on and off antidepressants is hard on the body, especially our bodies. So we want to be sure it is the appropriate path. Trying to use talk therapy to address an inflammatory-driven process is crazy-making for the patient, especially if you are a kid. I would know. Additionally, dysautonomia is a condition commonly associated with long COVID. Dysautonomia is the dysfunction of the autonomic nervous system, which controls many of the automatic processes in the body, like breathing, digestion, blood flow, and the pumping of the heart. When dysautonomia kicks in, fight or flight kicks in too. Many of our symptoms mirror anxiety, but as you can imagine, treatment is very different. We need mental health professionals who are knowledgeable about long COVID symptoms and how long COVID can present as behavior and mood. Talk therapy and medication to stabilize more standard mental health conditions can be life-changing when appropriate, but it also can be an impediment to medical care when not appropriate, which was the experience I had. It's all very nuanced and requires full partnership with the patient or caregiver to sort through that nuance. Because as patients, we just want to get better. The lack of understanding of symptoms, triggers, and the need to pace combined with the lack of resources in many school districts, have resulted in many, if not most, of our long COVID kids no longer present in physical buildings. The physical buildings of schools. Many schools lack functioning elevators, or long COVID kids are told not to use them if they can walk. Campuses are often too difficult and overwhelming to navigate. The standard structure of a school day is inaccessible for many of our kids. For example, 7:30 a.m. classes are virtually impossible to attend when a long COVID kid is in a flare. Mornings are often our hardest time. Additionally, many of our families have felt forced to pull their children from school due to high levels of community spread and the very real risk of further disability due to reinfection. One mother shared, "My daughter has already had COVID twice. That I know of. While she has lasting symptoms from the first infection, it was the second infection that disabled her. We can't risk another infection." I do not have concrete data to tell you how many of our kids are not in physical school buildings. I don't believe there's any data that is actually being collected. But based on community observations, most of our kids are either in a modified half-day program, in a homebound program, attending school virtually, which are usually charter schools, as many school districts do not have a virtual school option anymore, or parents have pulled their children from school altogether and assumed the responsibility of homeschooling due to their school's inability to meet their child's needs. Another significant issue is that school districts are struggling to staff homebound programs. Here are a few ways to make schools more accessible to long COVID kids according to families. Let them use the elevator, even if they say they're feeling okay. Don't make them participate in PE. Classwork and homework need to always be available online for the days kids can't make it to school. Long COVID kids shouldn't be required to come to school every day due to the toll it takes on their bodies. Often even a modified day schedule can be too much. It's important for our kids to stay connected to schools and connected to community. We need to get creative about how to maintain that connection. So I just covered the pressure points between families and schools regarding long COVID, and hopefully provided some guidance on how we can improve. Now I would like to share with all of you what keeps me up at night when I think about long COVID kids, with the hope that if I share these concerns with all of you today, we can work together to address them. I worry about the kids with long COVID whose families don't realize it. I worry there are kids out there struggling with the symptoms of long COVID, but believe it's a character flaw instead of an illness. I worry about the kids who don't have access to resources, including medical care. I worry that the symptoms will be so overwhelming that their only management tool will be to disconnect from their bodies. That was the strategy I used to manage my symptoms. It was almost like I couldn't feel anything from the neck down. It's a highly effective strategy, but it comes at great cost. When you disconnect from your body, you disconnect from your intuition. You disconnect from your internal knowing, making you more vulnerable to people who intend harm. When you disconnect from your body as a kid, it disrupts your ability to form an identity, to really know who you are. We gather information about the world around us through our body, through our 5 senses of sight, touch, smell, taste, sound. The information gathered helps us form our perception, which informs our ability to critically think. If we are disconnected from our bodies, we are disconnected from our senses, and we do not trust the information gathered, which makes trusting our own perception challenging. Being disembodied makes it difficult to establish a sense of safety from within. Silencing our symptoms makes it impossible to manage our symptoms. And the symptoms usually get louder in response, and then we get sicker. There are significant consequences to not providing children the resources to manage the symptoms of long COVID. I worry that many of our long COVID kids will not be able to maintain employment as adults. Up to 65% of adults with long COVID cannot work full-time. We lack the data to know if there are parallel effects on children. When a long COVID child becomes an adult, if they are not able to work, they will not qualify for many of the social programs, including Social Security disability insurance. Because so much of our social safety net requires a work history that long COVID kids will not have. I worry some of our kids will be caught in cycles of poverty and will struggle for the rest of their lives, as the disabled in this country often do. I worry about kids with fatigue who are labeled lazy, kids with brain fog who are labeled defiant, and kids for whom irritability from pain and sensory overload will be labeled a bad attitude. I worry about the possibility of kids being abused because they have the disability of long COVID. I worry about the disability to prison pipeline, as individuals with disabilities are overrepresented in the prison system, and young people with disabilities can easily be caught up in a cycle of disadvantage and punishment, leading eventually to incarceration and the adult correctional system. We need to proactively work to identify children with long COVID, because early intervention is vital. It helps slow, if not stop, the progression of symptoms. We need to accommodate long COVID kids so that they can stay connected to schools and have the opportunity of an education. So I know I've shared a lot with you today, but before I end, I would like to say something to those of you in the audience with long COVID or who care for a child with long COVID. I have a saying I repeat to myself often as it provides me clarity. So I would like to share it with you for what it's worth. The saying is, take care of your body the best you can. Stay open to healing, but stay grounded in your body's needs today. This may not be the path any of us would choose, but it is the journey being offered. Keep showing up for life however you can. Stay connected to community. And please know all bodies are worthy bodies. All people are valuable. You are worthy. You are valuable. Don't forget that. Thank you for your time and the privilege of sharing my thoughts with you today. What we're going to do now is we're going to invite our board member, Gretchen Kelly, to join us.
Hi.
Hi. Make sure.
That was beautiful, Megan. Thank you so much.
So Gretchen is a board member here at Long COVID Families. And Gretchen, why don't you go ahead and tell us about your family?
I have a personal experience as someone with ME, and I have a child that has chronic Lyme. So while my child doesn't have the experience of long COVID, there's a lot of overlap and similarities with chronic Lyme. And it's one reason why I'm invested and passionate in helping kids with long COVID. Just everything we've been through, it's the cause of long COVID is very personal to me, especially as it relates to children. So can I just jump right in responding to your speech?
Mm-hmm.
So I view this as where I was early in my child's illness, before we had a lot of answers, before we truly understood what we were dealing with. And I kind of try to view this through what would have helped me as a stressed out parent who really needed answers and some guidance. So there are a few things that you said that really jumped out to me that I thought were super helpful and maybe would be good to elaborate on maybe. Yeah. When we talk about the trouble that kids have communicating their symptoms, some kids lack the language, they don't even understand. They might say, my throat feels tight when it could be, a rapid heart rate or even a pressure headache. So what would you suggest, having experienced it as a kid, and then also as, you were an educator and as a parent, ways that we could try to kind of sift through the things our kids tell us, to try to document and kind of put the pieces together of what the symptoms our kids are feeling, so that we can then go take that to the pediatrician.
Right, because these symptoms are so subtle yet so loud, right? Has such a tremendous impact. So one of the things is, I think if you were raised anything like I was, a lot, it was like, can I rub dirt in it kind of a thing when I skimmed my knees, get up, shake it off, keep it moving. Mm-hmm. I think there is just an encouragement to pay attention to the body and what the body is telling us. So I think one of the things I've shared with my daughter, so I have a 10-year-old, one of the things I've shared with my daughter is that symptoms is a way of your body communicating, mm-hmm. right? And so I think that's an easy way of framing it for kids. So if she put together that when she eats too much cheese, her stomach gets upset. And so her body's telling her to back off the cheese, right? And so that's a simple way of understanding that symptoms are simply information, and just kind of framing it that way, and kind of just being curious about what the information is sharing. One of the biggest things is, I don't believe that kids are capable of faking illness more than a day or two, right? They're just not capable of sustaining the act for very long. So I would not dismiss symptoms, especially in the environment, especially post-COVID, to immediately dismiss and say it's probably no big deal. I would just simply get curious about it. I wouldn't necessarily jump to any conclusion, just get curious about it. One of the things when you're identifying symptoms, a lot of long COVID in children manifest as syndromes, and syndromes are a constellation of related symptoms, right? Without an identified underlying cause at this time. So with syndromes, what you're going to want to look for is the pattern. So the pattern of the symptoms. So one, what are the co-occurring symptoms? So if a child's feeling fatigued, are there other symptoms that seem to come with it? So we look for co-occurring, how onset, when did this start? Did it start within a few weeks of an infection, right? Did it start after, a death in the family? The onset matters, right? So it's the symptom cluster, the onset, frequency, how often is it happening, when is it happening that they're reporting symptoms, duration, how long is it lasting, and the temporal, what they call the temporal nature of it when it comes to syndrome. So syndromes, by definition, wax and wane. And so symptoms will come and symptoms will go. And this is part of what's so confusing, because it's weren't you okay? I thought you were okay. Now you're not okay. So what we usually advise parents or anybody who's trying to track symptoms is to I actually did it for myself years ago, and I just referenced my biology 101 class, which is where I was first taught to keep an observational journal. And I just started writing down all the observations. And what's really interesting is to look at the symptoms through the five senses. You know, has your taste changed? Has your smell changed? These are very important with COVID, especially with children. We do have a caregiver interview coming up where she's talking about a toddler who lost the sense of taste and smell and how she caught it, because how hard is that to catch in a 2-year-old?
Yeah.
So it's important to kind of go through the five senses. Like I was just explaining, like my vision gets wonky.
Yeah.
And I now know it's barometric pressure changes. That's my trigger for my vision, also because it triggers a migraine for me, which I'm fine. But that's part of, like, it took some of the fear out of it for me as well, because when you suddenly lose your vision, that was actually the primary symptom that led to my own diagnosis, was that I was losing my vision. And I actually got in front of a neuro-ophthalmologist who was the first person to tell me about POTS. But before that, I was terrified because I had no idea what that was. And a lot of these symptoms are very scary for children.
I was just going to say, I think that's probably one of the hardest things as a caregiver, is how the symptoms come and go. And then sometimes we used to call it whack-a-mole symptoms with my daughter, because sometimes one symptom would seem to go away and you think, oh, okay, maybe whatever that is resolved. And then something else will pop up. And eventually you do start to see the pattern, like, oh, we've seen this symptom before. But as a caregiver, it can be so confusing. So yeah, I think documenting it that's one of those things I wish I would have known back in the beginning of my daughter's illness. I think it would have maybe, cut down on some of the confusion for sure.
And probably helped with the early intervention.
Right.
I know I mentioned it, but we do see families who are able to catch long COVID earlier and are able to implement strategies to manage the symptoms seem to have better outcomes.
Right.
I think sometimes we kind of default to, well, we'll just wait and see. It'll probably get better on its own. And unfortunately, what we see in long COVID kids is the wait and see. It gets worse rather than better. It's the families that intervene and help manage symptoms that tend to have better outcomes.
Right. Maybe a little overreacting in this case is not the worst thing, because better to be cautious. I wondered if you could elaborate a little also on the post-exertional malaise, which is like, I feel like if you are not in the ME or chronic infection community, that might be a little more vague. And then, you said that it could be triggered by a number of things.
Yeah.
I know one thing that it honestly took me years to realize with myself is sometimes emotions can trigger PEM, can trigger a crash. So, which is not something I ever connected to my symptoms before, but like you mentioned, the death of a loved one or death of an animal, or just even something very emotional, a fight with your sibling that just gets you worked up. And then a day or two later, your child is just wiped out and is experiencing PEM. So I feel like some of those things can be so particular to the child and to the circumstances.
So I first developed symptoms of PEM when I was 11. I told myself that, and I noticed it when I couldn't keep up in soccer, that after a soccer game, I would go crawl into bed and sleep for 4 hours, get up, eat dinner, and then sleep the rest of the night. My parents thought I was growing. I actually think I was already my height currently. So it was very easy for parents to be like, well, she must be growing, that's why she's sleeping, or she must need the sleep. So no, it was the exertion of the soccer game. And then I was crashing. And it took me 15 years to figure out that pattern myself, because it was really, I'd never heard of anything like that. It is, so if you think of energy, like we use the analogy of a battery very intentionally, because it's like any output of energy is going to drain it. So that can be like you're having the greatest time at a party. It's going to drain you, right? It could be you're watching a Lifetime movie and it could drain you, right? And so it's just being aware of these things, and they're individual. And so again, this is where observation and tracking, and if you have long COVID yourself, write it down. I have learned the hard way. Write down your observations, because if you think you're going to remember it, you may not. Right? So it's good to write it.
Very helpful. Very helpful.
I do want to say it helps you from gaslighting yourself too.
Yeah.
Or about like, I've had a lot of parents share with us that like they've seen things, they know something's wrong, something's off with the kid, but they can't quite put their finger on it. So they end up almost like dismissing their own parental intuition. If you start writing down your observations, then it becomes a little more data-based.
Yeah. Create a paper trail of what you're observing, and it makes you a lot less likely to be able to brush it off or minimize it, for sure.
Yeah. Conversation is super helpful. So I am going to say goodbye to you, Gretchen.